The government has dismissed a leaked memo which says a comprehensive plan for Brexit could take another 6 months to develop. A spokesman described the document as unsolicited and insisted it had nothing to do with the government at all. The memo, which was prepared for the Cabinet Office by a consultant and leaked to The Times, suggests there's no common strategy between ministers and that up to 30,000 extra civil servants may have to be hired in order to deliver a Brexit deal. The government says it doesn't recognise any of the claims it makes. Our chief political correspondent, Norman Smith, is in Westminster. So how much attention should be paid then to this document, Norman?
Well, Jana, the focus is on this memo because it goes to the heart of the Brexit debate, namely, what is the plan? And raises questions about whether government can cope with the scale of the task involved in Brexit. And perhaps for that reason, the government has gone on the offensive to, in effect, say the memo is of little consequence. Let me just give you some of the words they put out in a statement. They said it's, quote, an unsolicited document. In other words, it's not government inspired. It's not a government report. It says it has nothing to do with government. The suggestion is it was written by an individual at the accountancy firm Deloitte, and it says it has no authority. And behind the scenes, there is a suggestion that perhaps Deloitte were looking to bid for government contracts. Perhaps they were trying to suggest there might be a role for Deloitte in the Brexit process. But in terms of the political debate, it has, of course, been seized on by Theresa May's opponents to buttress their case that the government simply lacks a clear strategy for Brexit. This was the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell.
It's chaos. It's what we've suspected. I think what's really anger-making for everybody is that before the referendum, the government never put in preparations just in case the referendum went towards Brexit. After the referendum, we know the result, and now ministers are falling apart. And it takes an objective assessment by a consultant to demonstrate that they're in chaos, they're in disarray.
Now, what this memo says in terms of the lack of a plan, it suggests that different government departments are pulling in different directions because they have their own particular interests. So the Treasury wants to look after the city, the business department after industry, and culture is interested in the telecoms industry. And on top of that, it points to tensions within the cabinet between, it says, the Brexiteers and the Chancellor Philip Hammond. Speaking this morning, the UKIP leader Nigel Farage also piled in, saying he wasn't surprised at the apparent lack of a plan because he said the cabinet was made up predominantly of people who'd argued against Brexit.
Well, there was no Brexit plan because I think the previous government thought that Brexit had no chance of winning, therefore there was no reason to put Plan B into place. So, yeah, in many ways, Theresa May's government is starting with a blank sheet of paper. I would just say this, there are two ways you can look at it. You can say, gosh, look at all these things we've got to do, what a burden. Or you can say, we're about to take back control over every sector of our lives, what a fantastic opportunity to do things better.
Well, I'm joined now by the prominent Brexiteer, the Conservative Iain Duncan Smith. Do you accept, leaving aside the authorship of this report, there is a question mark about the lack of a plan?
Well, first of all, I don't think you can just leave aside the authorship. What I thought when I heard this morning, this is another one of those reports that actually probably wasn't even commissioned. It turns out that it wasn't commissioned. It was an unsolicited report done by a group of people that want to get some business. Well, good luck to them, but they weren't asked to do it. So it's quite important to know they didn't have access, they didn't talk to the departments, they've gone on a lot of stuff that's in the media, they've put it all together, they put 2 and 2 together, they come up with 22.
But is it true?
Well, what's true about it? First of all, it's utter nonsense, by the way, about the number of civil servants. And I've sat in government, there is absolutely no call for vast numbers of civil servants. Quite the contrary. Each of the departments was commissioned, as I understand it, by the Prime Minister with David Davis to get on to look at their own areas of the regulations and laws that would need to either be absorbed into UK law or actually would have to at some point be repealed. All of these things they're getting on with right now at the moment. That's why you can't immediately jump to start the process of Article 50 apart from the court case. So there's some logic to the fact that they're doing this work. It's not about pulling in different directions, it's about actually taking a view about your own department. Then it's pulled together with Downing Street and David Davis, and that's the right way to do it.
What do you say to those who say it's simply not good enough for ministers to retreat into this formula of Brexit means Brexit? This is a huge moment for Britain. We need detail. We need to see a plan.
The honest truth is they don't need detail and they don't need the plan right now. The only time you want the plan is when we're ready to trigger Article 50. Actually, the truth is this has been driven by an insatiable desire of the news media to actually have something to talk about. This is
Well,
not...
it's more than that, isn't it? We want to know what is going to happen with one of the biggest decisions in our lifetime.
Norman, but she hasn't triggered Article 50. So right now, it's quite right, I think, for the government to get their act together internally to know what they actually plan to do at each stage of this process. And that takes a little bit of time. I accept that. I think they could do it faster, but that's my personal view. But nonetheless, the Prime Minister has given an end date, and when she says she doesn't want to debate this in public all the time, I think it's fair and reasonable. Now, I can understand the news media's desire to have something to talk about every day, but this story is a little bit of a ridiculous story in one sense, that it's not a commissioned report, it had no access, there were not people in the departments, they're just going on hearsay, and much of it which was already published in the papers.
Isn't it reasonable that when the Prime Minister comes to trigger Article 50, she should at least set out the bare outlines of what she is seeking to achieve, that there should be the outlines of a plan?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that that is exactly what she plans to do. She said as much in many
She
senses.
hasn't. She always says she cannot reveal her negotiating
Not the
hand.
details of it, but she's quite clear. She'll be clear about what we're trying to achieve in overall terms. But of course, all of these things are about how these discussions go with your counterparts in the European Union. And I don't think they'd be very happy if we were to say this is what we're going to do, full stop. At this point, they need to talk, and they don't talk till after Article 50 is triggered.
Your sense is, when Mrs May triggers Article 50, she would seek to set out the broad outlines of a plan?
Well, she will do that because it will become public quite quickly anyway, and I think she's already indicated that she's not just not going to say anything, she's not going to say anything till she's ready. And I think it's quite right. And by the way, in this report there is something really fascinating, that people are critical of the fact that the Prime Minister wants to take central control. They would be critical if she didn't. The truth is, she needs to take central control because at the end of the day, this whole negotiation is about her. It's not about David Davis, it's not about the Chancellor. She's the one that has to call the shots because she's the one doing the big negotiation.
And when she triggers Article 50 and maybe sets out the outline of a plan, should Parliament be given a vote? Because surely that would buttress her position if she went into the negotiations having a clear mandate from MPs.
The thing about this you've got to be very clear is it's impossible to get 650 MPs to agree almost anything about this process. So the last thing you need is a bunch of MPs, each with their own predilections, fears and worries.
But that's Parliament.
That's Parliament, that's fine. You can have as many debates as you like, that's not a problem. And you'll have 50 different positions from 30 different MPs. My point is, that is all about taking consideration. What you can't have is Parliament try and run the negotiation. And for those who say, oh, we just need to know because we have to vote, the answer is what you start with and what you end with are not necessarily going to be exactly the same. So she has guaranteed that at the end, Parliament will have a view, and that's fine. But what's wrong is the idea somehow that you keep coming back to Parliament to ask their advice about stuff. That would be madness. No one can conduct a negotiation like that, and the European Union would be absolutely hacked off if that happens. So let's be sensible about this. She gets a plan together, she decides what she's going to do, she then invokes Article 50, she gets on with it, but she's quite happy to talk about the broad outlines, I'm sure of that, but not the detail. The detail would be ridiculous because some of it won't be in existence at the end.
Okay, Iain Duncan Smith, thanks very much, John. I should tell you it could maybe get an awful lot complicated, it's more complicated still, because we are, of course, still waiting for the case before the Supreme Court, who may well determine whether there has to be legislation to trigger Article 50 or whether the government can fast track it by simply having a debate in Parliament. So there's an awful long way to go yet, Joanna.
Thank you, Norman.